Welcome to episode 8, where we will start the process of making these donuts look yummy enough to eat. We've got our game-ready model, and now we need to take that into our texturing software and get down to business. I'm going to be using Quixel Mixer for this part, which at the time I recorded this video was a free software. By the time I got this video ready for release, Quixel announced that Mixer is undergoing some big changes, and so this episode may be obsolete in the near future. You can still access it here for free for the time being. The link is in the description. And I will try to redo this part of the tutorial later with another free option called Instamat once I have some time to learn that program. While Mixer may no longer be a thing at some point, I'm still going to show you how I textured this model in Mixer. Many aspects of texturing in Mixer can be translated to other software, so it won't be entirely useless for you to go through these videos. Before we get into it, let's address the elephant in the room: Substance 3D Painter. Substance Painter is the king of all texturing software. It's super powerful. It will do all the baking for you, which eliminates the need for XNormal, and there are tons of tutorials and guides out there to help you use it. But it's quite expensive. At the time of making this video, you can either buy a subscription version or a perpetual version on Steam, although the perpetual version will not get any upgrades after the first year that you own it. If you have access to Substance Painter, I strongly recommend that you use that instead of Quixel Mixer or any other texturing software. In fact, if you plan to spend any money at all on this hobby, the experts I've spoken to thus far almost unanimously agree that Substance Painter is where you should spend your money first. But with that said, don't let a lack of funds get in your way. Mixer, and I'm sure Instamat, worked pretty well, and you can still make great things with it. Alright, we are going to spend 3 episodes on texturing. 3 long episodes, I should say, because there's a lot to do. In this one, we're going to set things up in Mixer and review how this whole texturing thing works. Then in the next one, we will actually make our donuts look like donuts. And in the third, we'll finish off the sprinkles and the plate and get all the final textures exported. To learn how to use Quixel Mixer, you can read through the online manual, and you'll definitely want to keep it handy for reference. I highly recommend watching the Mixer Fundamentals YouTube videos and their tips and tricks videos. Links to all of those are in the description. Okay, let's get into Mixer. I'm going to assume that you have it downloaded as per the first video of this series, and that you have sorted out how to log in. When you open Mixer and are logged in, you should arrive first at a screen that looks like this. Note that here in the project list, there are some sample mixes. This is a great place to find models that have been textured in Mixer and get an idea of how you can put together your own layers and masks, which we'll talk about in a bit. To create a new project, click on the plus sign next to Projects here on the left, and give your new project a name, like Skyrim Donuts, and then click on Add. Next, click up here on the plus sign for New Mix. Give this a name as well, and note that you can have multiple mixes in a single project. I'm going to call this mix Donut Plate 1, and I'm going to set the working resolution at 2K, because working in 4K slows my computer down a lot, and then I'll click OK. Note that you can work at a lower resolution but still export at a higher resolution later. You can also change the working resolution at any time, so don't worry too much about what you choose here in the first window. Mixer should open up a new file for you with a default plane loaded into the Viewport, and with the Setup tab selected over here on the right. Here is where we load up our 3D model and the awesome baked maps that we created in XNormal. Let's do that now. For Type, select Custom Model from the drop-down. Navigate to the final game-ready model that we made in the last video. Mine is donutplate.fbx. Select it and hit Open. You should see it load into the viewport. The next drop-down here is for texture sets. For our purposes, I'm going to define a texture set as the group of images that share the same UV map. So we have two texture sets in this model, the donuts, which are all on one UV map, and the plate, which is on a different UV map. When we set these up in Blender, we gave them each a different material, and that's how our texturing software knows to keep them separate. By default, the drop-down here should say From Materials, and the little line of text here should say that two materials were imported. If you click on Edit Materials, you can see them both listed here, and the part of the model associated with a particular material will flash when you click on the name. This new window that opened up is the Material Editor window. You can get here from either of these two buttons, either Edit Materials or Edit Texture Sets. They go to the same place, just different tabs. Click on either button, if you haven't already, to open that Material Editor window, and then click on the Texture Sets tab. This is where we load in the maps that we baked in XNormal. We need these maps to form the base of our model's texture. Without them, there is no information to build on. When you get more advanced, feel free to explore the settings for how to do a bulk import using this button here labeled Import All Maps. To keep this simple, I'm just going to load in each one separately. We only have 3 or 4 for each texture set, so this won't take long. Before we do that, note that here is where you can change the working resolution in this dropdown. But remember, this is not the final resolution, so don't fret over it. I have found that working in 2K seems to be a good balance. Now load in the maps. With the Donuts texture set selected, click on the little folder icon here where it says Import Normal. Navigate to where you saved the Donut Normal map, select it, and hit Open. You may notice your model starting to look like something already, and that's because XNormal automatically applies these maps as we load them in. Do the same thing for the AO, or Ambient Occlusion map. Click the folder, find the Donut Occlusion map, select it, and hit Open. And then the Curvature map. Click the folder, click on the Donut Curvature map, and then Open. For the donuts, we also have a Material ID map, so click the folder here where it says Import Material ID. XNormal calls this one vCalls, so select that and then click Open. You should see a list of colors populate behind this window over here. We will assign these to the model later. Now we repeat the process for the plate texture set. Select it over here on the left, change the working resolution if you want, and then we import the maps just like we did for the donuts. Click the folder for Import Normal, find your plate normal map, select it, and hit Open. Repeat for the plate AO map, and finally for the plate curvature map. Note that we aren't using the cavity maps that we baked for either of these models here in Mixer. We could use them as masks, but that's a topic for another day. So, as I noted in text in the last video, we did not really need to bake the cavity map. We're actually going to make another one later anyway, because we have additional texture details that we're going to want to include on it. Okay, with all the maps imported here for both of our texture sets, just close this window by clicking the X in the upper right corner. Into Viewport, you can see that our maps are already going to work, especially the normal map. And this is so cool, isn't it? Let's learn how to navigate around in Mixer's Viewport so we can take a closer look at our model. To zoom in and out, you can just scroll your mouse wheel and this will move by increments. There is also a smooth zoom, which I'll show you in a minute. To move the model around, press the middle mouse button and drag. To rotate, you first have to hold Alt on the keyboard and then left-click and drag your mouse. The pivot point will be wherever your mouse pointer was at the moment that you hit Alt and started the rotation. There's a little circle there to represent the pivot point, which you might not be able to see right now over the whiteness of these donuts. If you hold Alt and use the right mouse button, you can do a smooth zoom in and out. This is useful when you can't quite get the zoom the way you want using the middle mouse button. Another thing you might find useful is moving the light. Hold Shift and click and drag with the right mouse button to rotate the light around the scene. Okay, next, let's quickly review all the other buttons and tabs up here. On the right side, we are still in the Setup tab. Once you have your model set up and the maps loaded in, you probably won't really need this tab anymore. But remember that this is where you can easily change the resolution of the working textures if you want to see more or less detail. Moving on to the next tab, Display, this is where you can change how you want the scene to look. Feel free to play around in here if you want to change the lighting or other settings. One thing to note is that you can change the background to an HDRI right here in the dropdown. But unfortunately, this is really limited. You can only use HDRIs that come with Mixer by default. There does not appear to be a way to import your own. The next tab, Performance, is where you can change settings to help your scene render faster. This becomes important once you build up a lot of layers and maps for your model. If things slow way down, you can come in here and change the default settings to speed things back up again. The Export tab is one we will talk about later when we're ready to export our final texture images. And that leaves us with the main tab over here, Layers. This is where all the magic happens. When you select the Layers tab, you should see that we have something here called Layer Set 1. Since we have two texture sets, one for the donuts and one for the plate, Mixer has created this for us by default. A layer set can be assigned to just one texture set or have multiple texture sets. For this model, there aren't any textures that we want to use on both the donuts and the plate because they are quite different objects and will look completely different from each other. So we just need one layer set for the donuts and then a separate one for the plate. Just leave it set like this for now with only donuts ticked over here. Before we get into layers, what they are and how we use them, let's finish our tour of the Mixer window. Over here on the left, we have more tabs and the menus at the top. The menus can be explored at your leisure, and they are more for general software functionality like saving, preferences, and so on. I'm not going to take the time to go through these right now, since the only thing we really need for our donuts is File Save or Save As. The tabs here, Viewport, Local Library, and Online, are where you can see the assets available in Mixer. Viewport shows whatever you are working on. The Local Library shows assets that you have downloaded. And the Online tab is where you can explore additional assets to download. And there's a lot. Remember that this might change with the changes that have come from Mixer, but at the time of recording, this is what it looked like. Depending on what you have in Mixer, what you've downloaded, and which license you are working under, not all of the assets may be freely available to use however you wish. The packs available at the time of install should be fine to use on things that you will make publicly available. If you manage to grab the huge library of Megascans that were made available at the end of 2024, then I believe you can also use those. But make sure you familiarize yourself with the license agreement that you fall under, and choose assets that you know can be freely used if you plan to someday release your work to the public. The last thing to go over here quickly are all the little buttons up here along the top of the viewport. The first one is a drop-down that you can use to see your model textured in a specific way, and you'll probably use this a lot. By default, it's set to PBR metalness, and this is the overall final way the model looks when all the texture maps are being applied. You can see the various options here in the drop-down. You can try some of them out, though we don't have much to see here yet except the maps that we've imported. This will get a lot more exciting later on. The numbers on your keyboard will cycle through these as well. The major ones to remember are number 1 for the final overall texture, number 9 for the layer mask, which we'll get to shortly, and the number 0 for the active mask, which we'll also cover in a bit. Next to that is a button where you can select what you want to be visible. There are different options in here. You just click the little eyeball to toggle visibility on or off. Our model is pretty simple, so for now, I suggest we just leave them both on. Next up are 6 small buttons that also control visibility of different aspects. Displacement, which I usually leave on but we don't really use for this model. Tiling, which I suggest turning off for a model like this. The grid, which you can turn on or off, whatever you prefer. Active area focus, turn on or off as needed. And then show transparency, which I generally leave turned on, and show emissions, which I assume is for glow maps and such. This button here says that 3D is the current view of our 3D model. You can change it to 2D to see the flat images instead. This is useful for some things, and we'll actually be using this for some stuff later on. The last drop down here is for the lighting mode. We want the most neutral lighting that we can get, so Studio is probably the best choice. It might look super bright, and you can turn down the lighting intensity in the display settings. Now let's talk about the Layers tab, which as I mentioned is where all the hard work gets done. Texturing our model is done by layering images on top of images on top of images, and also by applying things that we call masks to control what gets through to the next layer and what does not. By the end, you're going to have a lot of layers here, and this stack of layers gets resolved from top to bottom, giving you the final result that you see in the viewport. We're going to start by adding some textures here, and then we'll talk some more about this as we go. First, let's get organized. We have a layer set here for our donuts. It has a non-descriptive name, so let's fix that. Double-click on Layer Set 1 here in the Layers pane, and rename it to something more useful, like Donuts, since we are applying this layer set to our donuts by having that box ticked over here on the far right. We can go ahead and make another layer set for the plate by clicking this Stack of Squares icon up here. Double-click on that one and rename it to Plate. Then assign only the plate texture set to this layer set. If you need to get back to these tick boxes for any reason, just click on that layer set again in your layer stack. Now is a good time to save the project. So go to File, Save, select the mix we created earlier, and hit Save. With that done, it's playtime. Now let's go break some stuff. Click back on the Donuts layer set and add a surface layer, which is the first little icon that looks like a grid. When you click that, you will see some cool looking spheres show up in the viewport. These are all the assets that you'll have available from the local library. You can filter by category or search by name over here on the left. And note that there are different types of assets which you can see in this little drop-down list. For now, leave it on surface and scroll through the options in the window. Pick one that you like. Anything. This is just for playing around, and we're going to change it later, so don't worry about realism right now. I'm going to use this mossy ground, so I just click on it. Give it a minute to load, and then you will see that your donuts are now covered with that texture. You may have also noticed that we have more stuff over here on the right side now, and all of those little thingies control how this texture is being applied to our model. The blend section is where we can adjust height information for this layer. Feel free to adjust these sliders and see what happens. We'll be doing a little bit more of this in the next video. In the placement section, you can change how the texture is wrapped around the 3D model. For 3D models, you'll use box projection most of the time, since this will be the most seamless method. Note the scale setting in here, as this is where you can make the texture appear larger or smaller on your model. If you need to go higher than the default maximum value, just click in the box and enter a number manually. In the height frequency section, you can adjust how the larger versus smaller height details are handled. Play around with these settings a little bit to get a rough idea of what they do. Threshold controls the cutoff between what's considered high versus low frequency detail. Next, we have all the layer maps. I've linked a good resource about what all these maps are in the video description, so have a look at that if you'd like to dig a little deeper. Albedo is the base color, and you can change this by clicking on the little colored circle. You can use the color wheel, mouse over the screen anywhere and use the eyedropper, or enter values into the various boxes here. There is also an option to load in an image, a drop-down where we can set the blending mode, and sliders for some additional options. Metalness is next, and this will almost always be completely black for non-metal objects and completely white for metal objects. It has similar options to the albedo map. Roughness is just what it says, how smooth or rough your object is. This is separate from metalness, so don't let that confuse you. You can have smooth or rough metal, and you can have smooth or rough non-metal. Roughness is a sliding grayscale image where all white is completely rough and all black is completely smooth, and gray values represent various states of in-between. Displacement is height data, and you can see this changing on the model if you have preview displacement ticked on. I haven't quite figured out the nuances of working with this for 3D models, so I'll leave that to you to experiment further. Normals is the normal map, and Mixer will combine the existing normal map that we baked and loaded in earlier with any other normal data for textures that we add on top. You can see this by looking at the normal map view in the viewport, now that we've added a texture to our model. Occlusion is ambient occlusion, and like the normal map, it will combine what we baked and loaded in with any new textures that we add on top. And as I've just been doing, you can turn these layers on or off using the little eyeballs. Importantly, this does not just affect visibility in the viewport. The eyeball controls whether that map is going to be applied to the layer at all. So if, for example, I turn off everything except the albedo map, we lose all the other mossy ground information, and we're left with only what we loaded in for our normal map and occlusion map. The first trick to texturing in Mixer is learning how to use all of these maps appropriately for your layers. Sometimes you will want them all turned on, sometimes you will want just one or a few of them turned on, and sometimes you will want to tweak their settings like the blend mode, strength, opacity, and so on. The very first or bottommost layer is your base layer. Consider this to be a solid covering. It can't be masked out because there's nothing under it. All other layers will blend into or onto this one. And you can use masks to control how much of each additional layer will show through onto the next layer. Like layers, masks are a key component of texturing. So, what exactly is a mask? It's a grayscale image that you use to control what's going to be visible. In a mask, white represents areas that will show fully. Black represents areas that won't show at all. And shades of gray are different levels of visibility in between. Let's demonstrate by adding a solid blue color layer on top of the base texture. Click up here on the empty square icon, and then click the little gray circle next to albedo and select a nice blue color in the wheel. Note that this new blue layer covers our entire model right now. We're only going to worry about the color, or albedo, right now, so go ahead and turn off all the other maps for the solid blue layer. To change how this blue color behaves on the model, we can use a mask on the layer. Right-click on the layer and select Add Mask Stack. It's an empty mask right now, so it doesn't do anything. We first have to add a mask component by clicking this little square with a circle inside it. Let's add a noise component and pick the simplex option. And aha! Things look different. Try increasing the amplitude to around 3, and now you can clearly see how some parts of our model get the blue color and some do not. If you hit 9 on your keyboard, you can see only the mask layer being applied to the model. And flipping between 1 and 9, you can see that black corresponds to places where no color gets through from this layer, meaning there's no blue, while white corresponds to all of the color coming through, and the gray areas are where it shows through partially, depending on how light or dark the gray area is. This concept of using black and white images to control textures is what masks are all about, and it applies to many aspects of the texturing process. It will help a lot if you remember that white corresponds to 100% of the texture you're working with, while black corresponds to 0%, and gray is a sliding scale in between. This applies to masks as well as grayscale images like metalness and roughness. White is 100% visibility of a layer, 100% metalness, and 100% roughness, while black is 0% visibility of a layer, 0% metalness, and 0% roughness. And then shades of gray represent values in between 0 and 100%. We're going to do one more thing here before we wrap up this texturing prep video. We discussed layers and we discussed masks, and both are key elements to understanding how to texture your model. You can have layers on your model, and you can also have layers in your masks. When you layer one thing on top of another, you should be aware of how the images are going to blend. This can be controlled using blending modes. To demonstrate, let's add another layer onto the mask stack here for the blue solid layer. Click on the Mask Component button and select Pattern and then Gradient. And hit 9 on your keyboard so we are looking at only the grayscale mask. I'm going to collapse these down real quick using these little arrows for each mask layer just to keep things looking tidy. You can leave them open if you want. Okay, just like the regular layer stacks, mask layers work from top to bottom. And you can change how each layer will blend with the next layer down by changing the blending mode. To do that, go to this little drop down here that at the moment says Normal. Normal pretty much means it will replace all the stuff below it. But if you click through the various options, you can see how each blending mode changes the behavior. There's a great explanation of blending modes here in the Mixer manual. You might want to keep this handy, or you can just try different modes until things look the way you want. You do not need to memorize what each mode does. Now hit 1 on your keyboard so you can see all the textures combined on the model. And then cycle through some of the blending modes again to see how the blue color changes as you tweak the blending mode for this mask layer. Feel free to keep playing around with this. I find that it gets kind of addictive, but I'm going to stop here for now. The main points I'm hoping you'll remember from this video are layers, masks, and blending modes. And don't forget that almost all layers have blending modes, so you can also blend your main maps in different ways to get all kinds of cool results. We will get more practice with all of this in the next video when we texture our model for real. In the meantime, you are more than welcome to get a jump start by playing around here in Quixel Mixer. Add some layers and masks and other textures and just see what happens. And don't worry, even if you accidentally save over our first save, it's easy to undo things that you don't want by just deleting those layers or masks. I hope you found this intro to texturing in Mixer helpful. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the real fun. Bye!